Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Constant, and I would like to welcome you to 25 years of Scifest and to this particular webinar as well. So you may know me. I hail from SAFM. I am one of the presenters on the radio station, a public broadcaster, and it is a huge honor to be talking to a group of panelists on a topic which I probably don't know that much about, but like many of us, think I know more than I may know. So our topic today is around harnessing digital platforms for communication, education, engagement, and I've also added enjoyment as well, because I believe that that may be a possibility that we could investigate. And we'd really like the panelists to look at the challenges, the advantages, the fears, perhaps sometimes even the nuances of what it is that we're discussing. You know, we all think that technology is an advantage and that it democratizes information. But what does that mean in a country like South Africa, and indeed a continent like Africa as well? The question of lack of access, what does that mean when we look at the digital divide? But as I said, we do have the most extraordinary selection of speakers, and their CVs are longer than my arm. So I'll introduce them all to you, and then I've asked each of them, and I'll introduce them to you on that basis, to just really describe what it is they do and give us an opening statement based on the topic that we are talking to. So just for your reference, in the team, on the line, in the image, we've got Chanje Kunda, who's a performer, poet, writer, and filmmaker. We've got Toby Shapshak, who's an editor-in-chief at Stuff Studios. He's also publisher of Stuff magazine. Dr. Sibongiseni Totsajani is a DJ and a member of the Presidential Commission on 4IR. And Dr. Marina Joubert is a senior science communication researcher at Stellenbosch University. They each come in with a very, very different angle and certainly different skills and expertise, but I suspect they'll be able to offer an enormous amount to this conversation. Dr. Marina Joubert, Marina, if I may, I'd like to start with you. If you could just tell us briefly what it is that you do, but also talk to us about your response to that particular topic.
Thank you very, very much, Michelle. I started off my career as a scientist, but I realized very soon that I really wanted to do something to do with communication and writing about science. So I was fortunate that I was also able to do a course in journalism at Stellenbosch University, and that was too long ago to mention the year. But at the time, this combination of science and journalism was kind of frowned upon, like, why would you want to combine that? But it has opened many doors for me, and it allowed me to be part of, I would say, over the last 20 or more years, to see how science communication has grown and developed and blossomed in South Africa. So I spent many years in the trenches as a science communicator, working for various organizations and big scientific projects, which I thoroughly enjoyed, being that matchmaker between the scientists and the media. And then about 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to join Stellenbosch University because I realized that we still need an evidence base for science communication in South Africa. We need to know what works and what doesn't work in this country, in our context. We need research on science communication. And that's why it's so exciting for me to be in this position now where I can do research. And when I had the opportunity to do my own PhD, which was at a late stage in my career, I knew that I wanted to focus on scientists and why they communicate and why some don't, and you know, why they respond so differently to these challenges. And so one of the questions I asked some of South Africa's top scientists in my PhD research was about their use of social media, why they use Twitter or Facebook or not. And these are some of the responses I got. Some of them, and these were really some of the most well-known top leading scientists in South Africa. Some of them said, in response to this specific question, oh no, I don't do things like that. I don't go there. I stay out of it. I think it's just rubbish. To be honest, I hate it. And some of them were actually brave enough to admit that they fear it. They're really scared of social media. So they see it as risky and scary and dangerous, and they criticize it for lack of depth and lack of credibility and lack of context. They also think that people are not really able to distinguish between dubious content and trustworthy content on social media. Some of them see social media as a space for young people, and they see themselves as too old or perhaps too old-fashioned to use it well. And this is in line with studies in other countries that show us that scientists are very skeptical and sometimes just scared of social media. They often cite fear and time constraints as reasons for avoiding these platforms. And they also describe social media as frivolous and not really suitable for serious, rigorous scientific content. But of course, that's not true for all scientists. There are some scientists who are much more in tune with the potential of social media, who are keen to experiment, who want to do better, they want to master the skills. And then there are those who embrace it enthusiastically and who've really mastered it, and they benefit from it because they know how to use it strategically. They know that social media opens up new avenues for you. But I should say at this point that always we must remember that social media is a kind of double-edged sword. It's got fantastic potential, but it does have some risks. And therefore, it's so important that scientists must be equipped with the confidence and skills to use it well. In my study, I came across some scientists in South Africa who are fascinating and who are really active on social media. For example, sociologist Professor Tinayuku Maluleke from University of Pretoria has more than 54,000 followers on Twitter. He uses Twitter really effectively to boost his his presence in the mainstream mass media. He links it to everything he does. Wits paleoanthropologist Professor Lee Berger has about 17,000 followers on Twitter. They use it strategically to amplify their views and to involve people in dialogue. So it seems sorry, Michelle, I don't know if you're talking about
sorry, as we were saying earlier, let's just put a pin in that for a moment if we may, because I think that you're raising some really, really interesting things that we'd like to interrogate in a moment, particularly when we look at what's been happening over the last week with regards to science and media, social media, different digital platforms. I'd like to just introduce our other guests briefly. We've got none other than Dr. Sibongiseni Totsajani. As I mentioned, she is not only a scientist, she is also a DJ. I love that. And she is a very close, not close, but she sits on the Presidential Commission for IR. Sibongiseni, if I may call you that, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about the work that you do currently and also why you do it.
Good evening, Michelle. Good evening to the panelists. I am Sibongiseni Totsajani, and I serve on the Presidential Commission for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I actually founded and started a big data analytics business process model that I tested in 6 different countries when I was doing my PhD studies at UCT within an exchange program at Rising University in Canada. So how I actually come out with that in innovation is that I
Sibongiseni, you've frozen. I'm not sure if I'm the only one who's seeing that there's a freeze there. So why don't we try and get Sibongiseni back? Friedi, perhaps you can do that. And Chanje Kunda, poet, filmmaker, author, writer, actress, and plant lover, will go to you and we'll come back to Sibongiseni in a moment. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Yes, I'm Chanje, and I do poetry, filmmaking, performing, and yeah, so I was just going to talk a bit about my relationship with social media, and also with actually filmmaking and embracing technology. When I studied theatre originally at university and was into doing live performances, and I make and perform one-woman shows, and I found that mainstream media, the mainstream media were not, in the UK, were not focusing on Black artists and Black female artists who make an independent work. So I decided to use the social media platforms to increase my visibility, and in order to be able to having a social media presence meant that I could increase engagement, increase my audiences, and be able to communicate my message, and also the education that I've had. I want people to come and see my shows, and if you promote what you're doing on social media, that's a great way of increasing your visibility. And through this, I also learned that you can, as an artist, you can monetize your social media, because I wanted, as you can see around, I love plants, and I had an idea. I wanted to make a show called Plants Fetish, and I made a crowdfunder on crowdfunder.com and said, I would like to research and develop making a show about plants, and please donate. And I did a social media campaign across Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, just saying, I love plants and want to celebrate them, please contribute. And I raised £1,800. One donor actually donated £500 to this crowdfunder. I think this was an independently wealthy individual who was feeling benevolent on an occasion. Yes.
Someone be loving you.
Yes. Anyway, so this was like, that just bought me. It wasn't to buy equipment or anything. It was just simply to buy time so that I didn't have to work and I could just think about writing and performing with plants. And I took all my plants to a theatre, and I did a performance. So I got money from the box office and money from my crowdfunder, and created a show that ended up being booked for a national tour. So that, it's a great way of seed funding an idea. And I've also used being the National Black Writers Conference in the UK asked me to promote their conference on my social media platform. So I made a series of social media posts about the conference that I was paid for. So so you can monetize it. And for me, social media is a great way to communicate with audiences in your own country, but also communicate with audiences globally as well. And also making films means that films can be shown online, they can be streamed online, they can be emailed to different independent film festivals around the world. And mobile filmmaking as well is something that...
Let's get into that in a short moment, if we can. I want to introduce Toby Shak to you, and hopefully by the time Toby's finished, we will have Sibongiseni back online as well, so we could just close off with her. And then I'd like to take us into this idea of how we navigate narratives and what those narratives are. Toby, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, and hello everybody. I actually have some slides I meant to mention earlier, Michelle. I don't know if I can just share those quickly. I don't know if that's possible.
Ryan, we'll have to see if Ryan can do that. There was a question.
Yeah.
Ryan is...
You can go ahead, Toby.
Thanks. So let's see if that shows. Obviously not. But it's only showing.
Yeah, we see your screen.
Yeah. It is not showing all the slides. There we go. So what I wanted to talk about is, I've been asked to do this, I think, in part because I'm a technology journalist. And as you can see on the right of your screen, I started out was at the left. publishing what was a print magazine, and it's evolved to a website, and it is also a YouTube channel, and we do podcasts, and we do a whole bunch of other things. And I was kind of thinking about the title of this talk and thinking that what's really fascinating is that if we have this conversation, and it's mostly older people talking about educating younger people, scientists with some experience and standing kind of, capturing the imagination of the youth. And it's kind of, we're talking about digital channels in the way, someone who breathes air would explain to a fish what water is, and they would go, huh, water, this is how we do it. But what we've got to understand is that you have to communicate to people in the channel that they prefer, or the medium that they prefer, because we live in a world of such enormous choice. There was a time where the only option was television. You could reach, 70% of American adults with one Super Bowl advert in 1976. And now to do the same, you would need, how many gazillions of clicks and likes and shares on social media. So the trick is you've got to fish where the fish are. And that increasingly is TikTok. If you want to reach a younger audience, this is a colleague of mine. She runs a very cool Instagram and TikTok account called @1000Limpopo Secrets. Now you can see she posted a video on Instagram. It got 3,759 views. Same thing on TikTok. It got 206,000. I mean, it's an order of magnitude more, 3 orders. And that's what's fascinating. If you want to reach the youth of the world and you want to engage with them, we have to think in the ways that they consume media. We have to think that we are talking to them in their language. And of course, the easiest way to do that is to hire an 18-year-old or hire a 22-year-old. The problem is so many people think of a portable computer as one of these 2 devices. The guy on the right could teach Eskom something about load balancing. And actually, the computer of today, the portable computer of today, is a smartphone. And it is enormously powerful. The services and apps we use, if you do take a picture of this screen, these are the apps that I use to run my business. We host our mail with Gmail. We use Dropbox to share things. We communicate via Slack, Telegram, WhatsApp. You don't have to have a Slack channel if you've only got 5 people in the team. A WhatsApp group is fine. I use Evernote a lot to save notes and documents. Google Docs, we share documents with ourselves, with the team all the time. And LastPass, of course, is the most wonderful password manager you could use. Also, Microsoft Teams. I mean, we're having this conversation via Zoom. If you're going to communicate on these channels, then, really go for something that is, go for something, I hope all my slides are coming up. Go for something like Canva.
No, they're not, actually. We're just seeing, we've got your left-hand slide and your right-hand slide. The right-hand slide makes me want to go diving for hours. And the left-hand side just makes me anxious because it looks so busy. That's so can you see, is the left-hand side now on the right-hand side?
No, we can.
TikTok.
Toby, we're on your presenter view and we can see slides 2 and 3 at the moment.
Okay.
Need to switch to.
Yes. Bizarrely, that's the wrong way around.
So why don't you? I mean, we don't.
So I've really made the points that I was trying to make, which is that
we don't need the slides. We need you.
Yes. We'll just kill that, and I'll tell you what the problem is. Of course, I've got my slides on my external monitor instead of the other way around. So I mean, really the point I'm trying to make is that I began as a print journalist, and then I worked on the internet. I helped run the Mail and Guardian when it was the first news website in Africa. And I've watched the evolution of media and how people consume media. And there's always a generational, we really knew things, our times were really tough, or our technology is fantastic, this newfangled stuff, and you hear the incredible criticisms of new technology. One of my favorites is how this new technology will corrupt the minds of the youth and introduce them to Satanism. And are we talking about the internet? No, we're talking about rock and roll in the 50s. and the same prejudice from every generation is applied to new generation. I am not of the TikTok generation. I don't feel bad about it. But if you want to reach the audience, as I was showing in the very busy slide, the only one you could see on the right, was that you could see that the TikTok is just far more popular. If you want to reach a certain age group and younger age group, you need to do that. YouTube has evolved to the channel where people go and learn anything. You want to learn how to sous vide a turkey, as I did this time last year, you go to YouTube, you watch the videos. That's where people are doing things. And everybody has to evolve towards that. And of course, I have a real soft spot for science communication. I was once a science editor for the Mail and Guardian. I have the very rare honor with my colleague Mango Sogod of being the reigning science journalist of the year, because I only ran the competition once. But that's what you've got to do. If you want to communicate to an audience, you've got to fish where the fish are. That's why I used the picture of the fish. And that's the key thing to communicating.
Let's pause it there for a moment. And I'm hoping Sibongiseni is back online again. I see her. I can see.
Yes.
You are. Fantastic.
Yes.
So let's just go back to you, and very briefly, if we can, with your fabulous backdrop, if you can just tell us a little bit about the work that you're currently doing. You mentioned good data, and maybe also just the Presidential Commission. I think that's a very interesting space for us to be talking about.
Okay. I'm Sibongiseni Tunzelana Tozajane. I serve on the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution in the country. What we've done is we've presented 8 recommendations to the country and to the president that should give input on what strategic direction the president and the country must take in terms of inclusivity when it comes to digital spaces. So what we have started, maybe highlight one of the key strengths of the recommendations is that we've thought about this fourth industrial revolution, but it starts with people. To have a human-centered technology space and also fourth industrial revolution application, we must understand that the innovation that we are developing and the apps that we are creating, the social media that we work on, we are doing it for people, by people. So the passion that really comes in my involvement is that I'm coming from a rural area of Makanda, Eastern Cape. How do we ensure that there's connectivity to every single South African who've been promised, but then how is everything in terms of South African infrastructure going to be rolled out to every single South African to ensure that we can have connected healthcare, we can have digital transformation for learning in terms of education, we can have safety and security in terms of applying all this innovation, which are key priority areas of our country. When it comes to technology, we must remember that technology enables a strategy. So technology is always an enabler, and it should be human-centered, and it should be putting people first. One of the things that we also found important, maybe how I come in and my value in the commission is that I am one of the first big data analytics specialists in the country, where I created the first big data analytics business process model in 2009 and 10 as part of my PhD studies, where I wanted to find out how do we then value data and how do we classify personal and private data and also public and open data, and how are companies such as Google commercializing data usage by offering freemiums. What does it mean to everyday people? What does it mean to you and I? How can then we understand also, as we are transacting on a daily basis, consciously or subconsciously, how do we then make sure that the data that's put out there we understand the value of it, and also how do we know on social media, sometimes we put our boarding passes when you're traveling overseas, that barcode can be translated into information that can be translated by hackers and cyber threat people and use it for not the purposes it was intended for. How do we then increase the level of digital literacy for every single citizen? How do we empower citizens of South Africa and the world to actually value and own their data and classify the information about the information or the metadata, and how to present it? For example, the WhatsApp policies that are coming through, where the social media apps are saying we can use your data, just opt in. And the phone number, as we know, sometimes in other banks is linked to banking details. So how do we then conscientize ourselves to make use of our data in our everyday lives and apply for IR in our daily lives? Thank you.
Well, Husseini, we're going to have to ask you, you've got very bad noise behind you, and I'm not sure if it's if you're in a space with a lot of people, if you could ask them just a little bit to maybe bring it down a bit. But I want to ask all of you, you know, the thing that you're all talking about is this idea of navigating narratives and how we navigate the narrative. So there are different platforms. I mean, we've got we've got Marina, who's talking about how scientists feel about social media, and yet it's a very powerful place for them to start to engage with the narratives that are critical to us understanding the language. Then we've got Chanja, who's like doing such interesting stuff, because what she's looking at is saying, okay, fine, I can take something which is very physical, very visceral, actually, and I can make it as visceral, and I can monetize it through various different social media formats. And then, of course, Toby saying the same thing, is that if you want to reach youth, then you have to navigate different narratives. I suppose the question that I'm interested in is that which one is ideal for what? I mean, Marina, when you talk to your scientists and they say, no, they don't go on social media and they don't like it and they don't, that's a real issue, because if they can't explain in layman's terms, in the language that I can understand as someone who is clueless, then how am I ever going to know, for example, that I really have to vaccinate? So what are you finding with regards to the scientists, where you can start to say, okay, here is a means and here is a language that you can use? How do they then shift their language into one for people like myself?
I always tell scientists that they should find their niche and they should find their voice. They should find what works well for them. And there are different ways of doing it. Some scientists engage directly on Twitter and they're comfortable with its limitations in terms of the characters and so on. Other scientists are better at other ways of engaging, you know, direct public speaking or mass media engagement. And interestingly, we've seen during this pandemic, in some research that I was also involved in, that high visibility in the public platform during a time of crisis is still linked to mainstream media more than to social media. The mainstream media is where new findings are announced and debated and discussed. And then social media is a little bit more where it's reflected and you know, where people can enter into dialogue. But these two complement one another. We see that, of course, in real life, you know, you don't want to separate them. But some scientists, for example, Professor Salim Abdul Karim, we all know him. He's become a household name during the pandemic. He's not very active on Twitter. In fact, his Twitter account is managed by his organization. So he's so active in the mass media and the mainstream media. So his Twitter account is more used to take that further and to allow people the opportunity to ask questions. So I don't think we should say that you cannot be actively engaged unless you use social media. But for those scientists who do find it the way to do it, you know, it can work really well. And if I may maybe add just one thing, if scientists tell me that they see social media as a place where fake news and misinformation is spread, I will tell them that that's exactly the reason why they need to be there as well, because they need to respond, they need to engage. If they're not there to counteract the misinformation, then the only news people will get is the fake news and the misinformation. So that's exactly why they should be there. And if it's not meant for every scientist, that's also okay. But those who who are able to embrace the platform, and very often it's the younger scientists. You know, there's such an important role for them to play there.
I'm interested because Gillian Ahrens has just put a question into the sidebar saying, before we tap into the available vehicle, how do you get them to want to engage? And I think that, Toby, what you were talking about, and Marina mentioned it now as well, is that sure, it is like for young people, for very young people, it's like breathing air. It's like a fish in water, whatever the case may be. But so that for them, it's not necessarily a need of wanting to engage. But I think what Gillian raises is an interesting question, and touched on by Marina, is this idea of an intergenerational conversation on digital platforms. How do you think you address that and then get, as Gillian says, people to want to get involved? I mean, I know I have certain social media forms that I'm more interested in. I prefer Twitter because I come from a sort of journalistic background and I love words. But I also know that Instagram is just gorgeous because I then get to see really beautiful stuff. Then there's LinkedIn, which for me, which no one really mentions because it is considered to be a bit kind of maybe funny.
Work related,
but I find it very fascinating because I'm so interested in like what people are doing. So
yes.
Do you get people involved according to the type of platform it is?
Yes, exactly. So I'm like you, Michelle. My bias is towards words. I prefer Twitter. I think it's more honest. I think it's more, it has had algorithms, but it's always kind of been that waterfall, what Gillian's asking about, differing timelines. I've always preferred that because there's an honesty to it. Sure, there's as much misogyny and misinformation and hate speech. But if you take Twitter and you insert Facebook or WhatsApp or the press or YouTube, you're going to have the same thing in every media. Every media has the same problems with misinformation. In South Africa, you have a whole independent media group that is a source of misinformation. So, people are not stupid. They understand things. I can't swear, but during the Oscar Pistorius trial, people kept saying, how do you know he's guilty? And I said, everyone has BS filters. When you're a journalist or a lawyer or a cop or a detective, they get better suited because it's what you do. So they're like muscles that journalists have, better BS detector biceps, or as do prosecutors and lawyers, and so. People know what's true and what's not true, and why do I trust if Michelle Constant tweets something, or Dr. Marina Hubert, or Chenda Kunda? If you tweet something, I'm going to take it at face value because I trust you. Yeah, it comes down to brands of trust, I suppose. And Marina, you've got to be having this conversation with scientists, because I've also been having it with them for 20 years. They all think we're far too hasty, I always wanted to write an analogy between scientists and those trees in the Lord of the Rings that can walk, and they think human beings are too hasty. So you've just got to say to people,
they were pretty speedy in their outcome of the last week, so we can be
indeed
proud of them on that.
So what we have is just the most extraordinary example of the most rigorous, high, excellent quality of South Africa's scientists, And what's been fascinating to me watching the narrative of the last week is that not just South African publications, I read The Guardian and the New York Times, I have a bit of a lefty bias, I'm sorry. And all of them have, and everything I see, all the tech publications I read, they're all praising South Africa's science. And that's an unintended benefit of it. The presidents had to come out swinging on scientists' behalf, and actually our research facilities in this regard are the best in the world. Why? Because we've been tracking AIDS for 30 years. So it's kind of that Talmudic mixed blessing,
So Monica, we're going to come to your question next, but I want to go to Chanja, who's got her hand up, and I suspect you've got a response to the question of the vehicle as well, Chanja.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about kind of Instagram and Facebook, and I think that those platforms are more perhaps better suited for social sciences and things of the like. So social sciences, psychiatry, and like neuro, things to do with neuroscience. And I just think, because from what I've seen on Instagram and what I've seen on social media, there's a lot of things that are being talked about around mental health, mental well-being. There's often new innovations in treatments for different like mental health conditions, because obviously we've had this CBT, then there's all the mindfulness, there's all these 5 ways to well-being. There's a lot of public health messages that can be shared through those platforms, and I think that they're just good for they're good for lay people. And as Freddie was talking about, not Freddie, sorry, Toby was talking about TikTok. If there was a public health message you wanted to get across to young people, then you would use TikTok, because or Snapchat in the UK is another popular one. So I think it's got to be age appropriate, and it depends on is it a public health message, and is it what type of science it relates to.
Okay, Monica, your question, and I'd like to put this to Sibongiseni, given that, when she was talking about the 8 recommendations, Sibongiseni, you were talking about the 8 recommendations coming out of the Presidential Commission. And Monica was just saying that whilst she understands that young people are often the target of social media campaigns, in my experience, it is older generations who share fake news, scam information, especially via Facebook and WhatsApp. And science education and digital literacy needs to target all age groups. And how do we go about doing that? Sibongiseni, I'm wondering, is that one of the areas that you are covering in the commission with regards to how do we develop targetable processes through social media, diverse platforms, but in ways that are, as you say, as Monica says, not fake news, not scam information?
Yes, Michelle, that's why we talked about inclusivity. Inclusivity talks to age, and it talks to race, it talks to every single South African, no matter the age. And also, we are really speaking to ensuring that in the inclusivity message, we are targeting every single department. We are targeting universities, we are targeting citizens, we are also targeting government houses and also accredited houses. That is why the message of inclusivity becomes key in what you're trying to do, because how do we then become inclusive for rural areas, for townships, for urban areas, for cities, for suburbs? We're not excluding anyone at all, because at any point, every South African citizen has a responsibility to be upskilled and reskilled, and it talks to every single person. That is why the work really took about 36 months, where we went to industry, we went to corporate, we went to academia, we went to rural areas, we went to townships to say, how do we ensure that this message starts with the people of South Africa? We are faced with the triple scourge of poverty and inequality and unemployment. But then also we have the wealthy, we have the rich, we have the people who are capable, we have scientists. How do we make sure then that we are making the digital divide closed, and we are making sure that our message is really inclusive in its nature? Thanks.
Sibongiseni, it's so interesting what you say, because one of the things that I've realized at SAFM, so SAFM, for those who don't know, is a national public broadcaster. And so because it's a national public broadcaster, you are broadcasting to an extremely diverse audience. It's not an homogenous audience at all. So you will have Donald, who is literally a truck driver from Rustenburg, to so-and-so who is a retiree down in Port Alfred, to Musi, who is a student, and these are all actually real people in Stellenbosch, and so the list goes on. And the thing that I find I find it fascinating, but I also find it very interesting is, what is the language that we use if we're going to navigate these conversations? And is there one language, or do we constantly have to be shifting and changing in much the same way that we're constantly shifting and changing platforms? Toby, your hand, you would like to
pick me.
May I just, before Toby comes in, may
Doctor,
I just
after
complete?
After you.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Toby. I think also the inclusive message speaks also to the differently abled people. So in the commission, we were intentional about it. We were talking about how do we make sure that the deaf, the blind, also are included in the assistive devices. How do we ensure that the 4IR enables what they need to do? It's really been a tough intention to make, but we had to be intentional about it, because if we were not, then we were not going to consider what we had to consider. So I totally agree with you, Mish, and I am going to give to Toby at this point. Thanks.
Toby.
I need to talk to you, Doc. I need to catch up and see what cool stuff you're up to. But here's the thing, right? So my job is to communicate to people. That's what a journalist does. Take an enormous amount of information, simplify it, explain it, communicate it. And there is a bias towards more highbrow forms of communication, especially by people who are, the scientist is almost always more educated than most average people, thankfully, being scientists and all. So there's a kind of bias to it. But what I've spent 20 years doing is taking very complex technology conversations, and before that science, and communicating them to people in the easiest way possible. I pride myself on not using big words, and you see, you know, it's if someone doesn't understand one of my articles, I don't think it's their fault. I think it's my fault. If I do a public talk and people don't get what I'm trying to communicate, I take that as criticism about my communication. So you've got to communicate with people in the way that they want to be communicated with. In a purely, I run a business. That's what my business does. It needs to talk. So we need to speak to someone through social media and TikTok. We hired a 22-year-old. You know, she's probably a bit old for the job. Only Michelle and I might find that funny. So you know, it's like, I remember Ray Hartley when he was the former Sunday Times editor, and he was the editor of the Times newspaper, and he hired this brilliant young multimedia journalist as the multimedia / video editor, Carly Ritz, who's got married and now is called Carly Simon, and she probably thinks this is all about her. And she was brilliant at her job. Why? Because she's a digital native. You know, forget about the born frees. Think about the digital born frees. You know, you got to remember, this is an audience. This, you know, the born frees who you say to them, you know, we didn't have the vote, and they go, oh, you know, we didn't have any airtime. They're like, oh my God. And I go, well, there weren't even any smartphones. Like, oh, what did you do? And we had this internet and these slow dial-up modems, you know. So I just think that it's incumbent on people who want to get a message to an audience, whether they're an audience who are interested in science or interested in smartphones or want to learn something in the world. You've got to communicate to them in the way that you do, but you don't have to dumb it down, and you don't have to change your style. You know, scientists are among the most eccentric of a special set of eccentric characters called academics. Academics are eccentric, and scientists are even more eccentric. You know, look at Richard Quest. He's become a phenomenon, and he's totally wacky. You know.
Marina, Toby, I'm going to jump in. Marina, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to comment very briefly on what Toby said about, you know, big words, jargon, as we sometimes call it, you know, and you also asked about, you know, the words we use. And I think when you ask that, I immediately think of two things. It's speaking in a language that people can understand, with empathy and, you know, with humanness, making the science human, but also there's also the issue of the language itself, you know, the different languages we have in South Africa. How do we create science vocabulary in all the indigenous languages so that people can also engage with science in their mother tongue? But on the topic of jargon, I just wanted to add something that I find fascinating. We always used to say, you know, jargon excludes people because they don't understand it, and you speak over their heads if you use too many technical terms. But recently we have research now that shows that jargon actually is far more damaging than that. If you use language that people don't understand, you actually tell them that science is not for them. They experience feelings of, this is not for me, I don't belong here. And that is why journalists and science communicators can play such an important role to help scientists with translating back to a language that you know, speaks to people's hearts and minds and in a way they can relate to. And it's an incredibly important topic that we definitely need to spend more time on. But we also have to understand how hard it is for scientists, because they spend years and years and years mastering this new language of their specific field. And it becomes really hard for them to go back to language that ordinary people, if I can say that. But I always, one thing I just want to add on this is I always tell scientists, please, please, please never say dumbing it down. You never dumb something down, you clear it up. If you use simple language, you're clearing it up, you're making it accessible, you're welcoming people in, and it's a big part of inclusivity.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And I think it goes back to what Sibongiseni was saying earlier. Toby, I see that your hand is up. Is it a brief comment? Because I've got a question for Chanje that I'd like to just, so go for it.
Very, very brief comment. I just want to say to the scientists, it's not just you. I get jargon-filled technology emails every day. And my rule of thumb is if a press release arrives in my inbox, there are a bunch of rules, but one of them is if it's in jargon and I can't understand it, I just delete it. You know, I know I could understand it, but why should I? You know, it's so it's not science, it's any complex idea. But I love that point you made about it intimidates people to the point where they think it's not for me.
Yeah.
You know, and that's profound. You know, when you know, I always think of what the great scientist said about Douglas Adams. I'll remember the scientist's name in a minute. He was talking about Douglas Adams in his obituary when Adams died. And his name was Douglas Noel Adams. He always used to joke, I was the first DNA at Cambridge. And he was saying that what Douglas Adams did was take science and communicate it in just the most brilliant way. And he said, Richard Feynman it was, and he said, Adams would say, think about the universe. It's big, really big, so big you can't. And it's just the most wonderful way to communicate it to people that doesn't use jargon, but uses our imagination. And I agree with you, Marina. You know, you spend a lot of time learning lots of big words. You want to use those words. You want to show your mother she got her money's worth, or father, they got their money's worth for education.
I want to just deviate for a moment to Chanje, if you don't mind. You spoke about monetizing your processes through digital platforms. And I suppose this is a question that I put to all of you, is does it make a difference when you have, I mean, Toby was talking earlier about 500,000 followers or whatever the case may be. Are you able to monetize if you have 500,000 followers, or are they just 500,000 followers that are not paying for a ticket seat that they could be paying for if they were going to see you in the flesh?
I think for me personally, it's not the number of followers. So basically, in terms of monetizing social media, if you've got over a certain amount of followers on, for example, Instagram or Facebook, then you can be like a brand ambassador. So then you can get, if you've got over 50,000 followers on Instagram could pay you every time you make a post, and also organizations who want to speak to the demographic that follows you can pay you to be wearing their outfit or tag them in one of your posts. So that's a way of monetizing social media.
Would you do that?
When
as a performer and an actress, would you do that?
When you've got this, no. Basically, I'm not saying no per se, but I'm not a pop artist. I don't work in the commercial industry, so I'm an artist, and I make arts films, and the films that I make are shown in art houses, in independent film festivals. They're not Hollywood blockbusters. So it's a different thing. So I'm a literary artist, and I'm a performance artist, and I'm actually currently working on creating performances in gallery spaces similar to the Marina Abramovich, the way that she presents her performances as fine art in galleries. And so that commercial side is different. And what I personally, how I've monetized my social media is you have a smaller following, but a smaller following of generous people who will pay you or pay for what you have. Because as I said, when I did my other social media campaign, I was part of the Manchester International Festival, which is an arts festival. So I was part of this festival, and there was a networking event where I was getting the business cards of people who were patrons to the Manchester International Festival, and there happened to be someone who's also a patron of the Lowry. So you've got wealthy individuals who are patrons to these international festivals or galleries. So I was collecting these cards so that when it comes to trying to raise finance for an arts project, I've got a crowdfunder that sits online that then I target people who are independently wealthy and channel them to my site in order to raise independent fundraising for arts projects. And also, if you've got a niche, then you can approach organizations within that niche and create social media content specifically for them. So for example, was creating content for the National Black Writers Conference. So this is not a commercial organization, but as somebody who has got a following on social media, and somebody who is a Black writer, they will pay me to create content to advertise their Black Writers Conference. So those are just the different, so there are different ways of monetizing your social media, and it does not necessarily have to mean you've got 50,000 followers.
So I want to ask, and Sibongiseni, I'll start with you, but I'd like to pass it around to all of you if you're interested in answering it, is I suppose is just, we've seen 18 months of grief and some cases gratitude, some cases pure anger. And I want to know, what has the impact of COVID been on the way we think about digital platforms? And perhaps what is the role of these digital platforms been? Marina, I'm sure you'll answer very specifically around how the scientists work, but you don't have to. But I wouldn't mind if you could just tease that out a bit. Sibongiseni, has that come up in your conversations and your debate?
Definitely. It has accelerated the use of digital transformation and also the uptake. You find that more people now are actually more connected than they actually could have been. And also you find that, especially in the space of education and teaching and learning, now the students are not going to class and the teachers are not at school. So now COVID-19 has made it all that much easier and faster for digital transformation to be more inclusive than it was. You find that now the country has sent digital devices with data. There are 0 rating sites, and also there's more conversations happening on social media. than that it was before. So acceleration has happened. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Marina.
Well, Michelle, it's really been a transformative period the last 18 months or so. What I can say in summary is that, in the past, when I said to people, I'm a science communication researcher, or I'm a science communicator, I had to do a bit of explaining. I think COVID-19 changed that. People really understand now the need for scientists to be able to explain. The scientists are in demand like never before. They understand the role of, expert journalists, specialist journalists. We've seen massive media attention and social media, attention paid to science like never before, and related topics, not only the biochemistry and the virology and epidemiology, but also the social science, the economics, the broader societal issues that the COVID-19 pandemic brought to the fore. And I think that's if something good came out of the pandemic, and I'm very hesitant to say that, maybe that is something good that we can take forward, but it also highlighted many of the challenges, of course, related to misinformation and dubious channels and so on. So I think scientists themselves and funders and policymakers have really woken up more than ever before to the importance of this. And we see now, in addition to scientists themselves wanting to engage and realizing its importance, we see that funders and policymakers are actually increasingly absolutely demanding that scientists must plan for engagement from the start. It mustn't be an afterthought that they do after they've published their research. It must be built into the process of research. It must be integrated. It doesn't necessarily take only one form. It can be a team effort. There can be different roles and different channels for different members of the team, but it must be part and parcel of the research. And I think we've got momentum now, and certainly digitization and online platforms is a massive part of that now. But we've got to be very, very careful, and we've got to pay serious attention to the lessons learned during this pandemic, and how we can do better. Should they, in future, I'm not hoping that there'll be anything like this in future again, but just generally lessons learned about engaging with society thoughtfully, respectfully, in dialogue, not speaking down to people, but really engaging people in a way that can build public trust and confidence in science.
Fantastic. I do want to note that if it looks like my screen is going all murky, it's because it's getting darker, and I'm not going to be going to switch on the light right yet, because I think it's just great. Toby, we've had two words mentioned now. We've had acceleration from Sibongiseni. We've had momentum from Marina. If you're going to talk about platforms, digital platforms, and the process of what we've seen in the last 18 months, how would you frame it?
So let me personalize it, because I think that's more useful. Stuff started as a print publication, and as print, as everyone knows, is a more profitable form of media than digital. And my business partner, Sally Hudson, and I have known that the change is coming, and the change is coming. And as much as it's not great to say there was something positive out of the pandemic, but don't waste a good crisis. And what happened was a switch from print to digital. And we noticed that, we've been incrementally moving towards digital, and people have stayed with the media that they know. And suddenly there was this switch over where we were all working from home. We printed the load shedding issue. I told my staff at the beginning of last year, it's the most important thing that's going to happen all year. Let's do this. We couldn't even get it on shelf by the time lockdown happened. And I think, if anything, it just showed us that we can move on. And the thing I've been saying for a year and a half, 2 years now, is human beings are designed to survive. Literally, it's called evolution. We just think it's got to take 200,000 years. The last 40, 50 years of human evolution have been phenomenal. The introduction of the silicon-based processor, the computer chip, the internet companies, the growth of Intel, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, it's fundamentally changed the world. We live in the water now, and the water is digital, and it's e-commerce, and it's all of those things that were science fiction. When I was a kid, I read Isaac Asimov, and it was, he had a thing called multivac. People do a search and replace. They take out multivac and they put in Google, and it makes total sense. It's the science fiction stuff that came real. I look at Elon Musk, who grew up in Pretoria, 50 kilometers from my house. We read the same books, we were the same kind of geeks. He's running SpaceX Tesla.
Wearing the most
You know,
dreadful shoes
what
I've
did
ever
I
seen
do?
in my life.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ma, I'll work harder. And I mean, we look at science as inspiration, you know. I mean, for years, science was so ahead of the curve. You know, if you read William Gibson, you knew about cyberspace long before, you know, it happened. Neil Stephenson, the science fiction writer who wrote a book called Snow Crash in 1992, envisaged the metaverse, which is now what Facebook wants to turn in. The rest of the world's going to move into the so-called metaverse. I mean, all of these things are changing, but I'm a pragmatist. I have to pay salaries for the 10 people or the 10 households I'm responsible for at Staff Studios. And that's the way I think about it. My job is to educate, communicate, entertain, all of those good things, you know, whilst doing what is essentially a public service, communicating as a public service, especially about science, and
let's
maintaining integrity.
Let's pause there for a minute, because I just want to, it's interesting what you say. I mean, you know, I can't remember, maybe you'll know who said it, but it was someone who once wrote, the magic of today is the science of tomorrow. And I have no doubt that that's exactly what we see all the time when we look at Gibson and those kinds of authors. Chandra,
I'm going to ask Multivac, I mean Google.
You're going to Google Multivac? Google. Chandra, for you and Rihanna, I see your question, and I'm going to put the question to the team as a closer once we've spoken to Chandra. Chandra, just briefly, as a performer, this use of, I suppose, platforms given COVID-19 and the lockdowns, how has it impacted you, briefly?
So could you ask that again?
Yes, and I was just saying, if we look at the last, 18 months, if we look at COVID and we look at the pandemic and what it has meant for so many people, what has it meant for you as a performer with regards to digital platforms?
I think the most important thing for me is the creation of content around mental health. The creation of performance material and films on the subject of mental health. There has been an incredible amount of stigma around mental health previously to the pandemic. I don't know, Meghan and Harry spoke about mental health on Oprah, and now it seems like if they can talk about it, then
but you probably were talking about it before then. They got it from you, pal.
Yeah. So I think it's really great, because it's this part of the pandemic has opened up a whole debate around mental health, and that's something that I'm really passionate about, people improving their mental health. And I think that through the pandemic, it's made more people be able to speak about mental health, create content about mental health, and in doing so, improve the mental well-being of a lot of people. And also the issues relating to domestic abuse and alcoholism and things like that. The pandemic has brought these issues up to the forefront for public debate and discussion. And I think that hopefully this should be the start of transforming our societies, whereby these issues can be solved and eradicated. If you can solve the issue of COVID-19 with vaccines, it's curable. We can also make sure that everybody is living safe in their own homes and have wonderful mental health and be full of joy. And we can do that. And I feel like this pandemic has given us all the opportunity to really look at those areas and really see how we can improve on those, and creating content around that.
So Rihanna, you've asked the question, and I'm sure the guys have read it, but I'll read it again. And I'd like to close with this. So in answering to our panelists, you can choose to answer the question, but you can also maybe give us your closing thoughts on the the last hour. So Rihanna was saying that the age range of the audience in modern times is vast. And whereas in the past, we were mostly accessed by adults, newspaper, radio, etc. I mean, we also have to ask what we think an adult is, I suppose. But she also says now opinion makers and consumers of news come from whichever age group gets a cell phone placed in their hands. How has the world of communication, especially science communication, shaped itself to address this phenomenon? So I'll put the question to all of you. And as I say, you may choose to answer it, but also if you could just give us your closing thoughts as well, that would be wonderful. Sibongiseni, I'll go first to you. I'm not sure, is Sibongiseni still with us? She might have had to leave because it's 7 o'clock. Okay, I think she has left. So Marina, I'll go to you.
Thank you, Michelle. I think that's a wonderful question to end with. My response would be that I see hope in partnerships between scientists and creative people. And that was also why I was so excited about this panel tonight. Scientists mustn't try to do everything themselves. They should partner with artists and novelists and animators and actors and filmmakers, definitely, so that they can create content for all ages. It's unreasonable to expect of scientists to master all these skills. You know, they need help. They need these creative partnerships to make fantastic YouTube content and plays and all these wonderful things, and thereby cater for a much more diverse audience. That's what my message to scientists, you know, get help and partner with creative people so that you can cater for more diverse audiences.
So instead of the STEM argument, we should be going for the STEAM argument: science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths. Chandra, I'll ask you to close off with your thoughts on the conversation, but possibly that question. I think Marina's given a great introduction to that.
Oh, you know, absolutely. I concur completely with what Marina said. I think, yeah, scientists can, you know, are really brilliant at what they do, and they can work with, you know, journalists, artists of all descriptions, in order to get their message across. So I would agree that, you know, that is great. Work with younger people as well. If you wanted to engage your scientific message to young people, get young people to create content for the platforms that young people would access. And yeah, that's my closing remark.
Thank you. Toby, I'll leave the closing words to you.
No pressure, thank you. You know, I'm a pragmatist. You know, I think what both Marina and Kanji have been saying, and what you've said, Michelle, are totally true. Do what you're good at, hire people to do what you're not good at. That's my business principle. I really mean it about accountants. I don't speak maths as a first language like most people in the arts world, although I'm not particularly arty, but that's the way I do it. And I hire people. You make sure they know what they're doing, and then you let them go. I mean, I've been having these conversations with scientists for 20 years. You know, you journalists, you like publish in a week. I go, a week is slow. It should be a hot 2 hours. You know, it's the internet now. And it's just bringing those diverse worlds together. You know, something like the conversation is just the most phenomenal innovation, isn't it? I mean, I don't know any educated, smart person with an interest in science, all of the above, who isn't impressed with this. I have read brilliant pieces by academics in fields I'm not interested in, but because they're well written and well edited, what do? The academics write them, and the journalists and the subs turn them on. And Caroline Southey, the extraordinary South African editor and journalist, is doing a brilliant job with the Conversation South Africa, and that for me is really wonderful. And I suppose we just got to start looking at how to do it via TikTok, you know. And I'm busy, you know, I'm busy thinking about that. You've really all made me think about that, Marina, you especially. You know, how do we communicate? It's a nice challenge, you know. Maybe we must crowdfund for you, Kanji, and instead of plants, let's talk about dinosaurs. You ready?
Really? So
thank you for this opportunity, Scifest.
Thank you so much for a really, really wonderful conversation. You know, I love this idea that actually we extend and join the dots in this ecosystem. It's almost like biomimicry in a way, so that we are generalists and that we do take interest in other things. And there's no doubt that if we can start to look at the world and see how the dots are joined, perhaps we will have, as Marina mentioned right up front, perhaps we will have more empathy for one another. And we start to understand that science is about you and it is about me, and it's a way of communicating very different things. And Chanje, you mentioned it as well, just talking about mental health. So I just want to say in closing, thank you for an extraordinary conversation. Every time I talk to people like yourselves, I feel absolutely honored to be part of a conversation like this, to learn from you. And I think our listeners feel the same way. It's really an extraordinary thing. And I want to say thank you so much. Chanje, thank you so much for making the time. Sibonga Seni is not here, but we'll thank her anyway because she was marvelous. Toby, thank you for making the time. We're very glad that you are still.
Can I thank you on behalf of everyone else, Sir Michelle Constant?
Well, let me say thanks to Marina.
Recently knighted, and Freddie, thank you for pulling it together, and Ryan.
Yeah. Well, just to all of you, thank you very much. And I do believe that more conversations like this, where we mix it up, where we mix up communication, we mix up media, we mix up creativity, we mix up science, and we mix up words and art, it really starts to make sense. So I wish you all a great evening. On behalf of Scifest Africa, which is turning 25 this year, I want to say well done to them. And let's try and get as much support for Scifest as we move forward into the future. So thank you all, and we wish you all a very, very good night.